You may not be supposed to, but nobody said I couldn't. You ever heard that before? And that's the modus operandi of Belshazzar. Well, Grandpa couldn't, but God never told me. Christian, we ought to think about that a minute, oughtn't we? Hey, listen, if it was wicked before, if the Christians of yesteryear shouldn't have, oughtn't we to fear? Hey, isn't our generation, and I think all generations are, but isn't our generation just a little worse than the generation before us? Wouldn't you say? You know, it's funny. The music thing's funny. It's a good test. Rock and roll, Brother Chuck, is it the same today as it used to be? Was it bad when it came out? It was bad back then. But today, don't you dare say the Beach Boys were a satanic group that were rebellious and against God. They were, by the way. There's one of the most wicked individuals in the world, the Beach Boys. And their music is vile and profane. A Christian oughtn't let it enter into their ears. And the Beatles were worse. They were Satan worshipers for real. They really were. And that's a fact. It's a historical fact. But their music's pretty nice compared to what goes on today, isn't it? And isn't it interesting that those things were unacceptable years back, but today, it's like, well, I mean, there's a lot worse out there. You don't have to, get after those guys. And I think Christians, and that's just an illustration of one area, one thing. Things that were shocking last generation of Christians, today we say, well, you have to pick your battles. You have to pick your battles. And you know what that's another way of saying? Well, God didn't tell me. God didn't tell me. And it's high time we as believers looked at who God is, because He's the same God that was, and He's the same God that will be. He's never changed. And if it was wicked then, it's wicked today. And if it was right and righteous then, it's right and righteous today. Sin does not change by generation. And neither do we. Pastor, we're way further gone than that. I mean, if the things that they were worried about 20 years ago were our problems today, I mean, things are just a lot worse. Friend, if we went back to worrying about what they worried about 20 years from now, or 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 60 years ago, we'd remind ourselves how to keep from getting where we're at today. I think it's the small things that are important to God, don't you? And I think it's high time that we changed our attitude about it. And stop saying, well, you know what? That's in the past. What we need to worry about is where we're at today. Maybe we need to get back to the past a little bit and look at what God was in the past so we can avoid judgment in the future. And here's Belshazzar that knows about Nebuchadnezzar, and his argument is, well, I mean, God didn't tell me. If God told anybody, He told you. That ought to be your standard. If it's wrong for them, it's wrong for you. Hey, what's this deal with leadership? Ought to have a higher standard. I'm for that, by the way. I think that you ought to have certain expectations of your preacher. You know, I think you ought to expect that your preacher wouldn't go certain places. Would you be a little surprised if you saw me in the movie house? You ought to be. I shouldn't be in the movie house. I should. You'd say, well, Pastor, that's kind of that's another one of those things that was a big deal years back. And it used to be wicked for people to go see Shakespearean plays years back. You look at what the theater used to be looked upon as. That was the most wicked, vile kind of thing. The opera and the theater, Christians didn't have anything to do with it. You study history on it. Christians had nothing to do with that profanity. And now we have it in our Christian colleges for fine arts series and that sort of thing. Because, you got to understand, the time period in which, well, just take God's standard. If we had to look at what God's people have seen in the past and go ahead and accept the standard because it represents the same God. Pastor, what if you saw your pastor in a casino around here? What would you think? Man, that's tempting too. They got those $6 lobster dinners. And I don't know if it's good lobster or not, but I've gone by and thought, man, I wish I could do takeout or something like that. I thought, man, what if somebody that was a Christian saw me do something like that? It would be awful, wouldn't it? Well, what in the world do you do in those places? You better not be there either. As a Christian, doesn't have any part of that. It doesn't matter who you are. There's places believers don't belong, never have, never will. Hey, I was in the bar, but I wasn't drinking. What are you doing in a bar? What would you think if I was in a bar? You think that ought to be a standard that I ought to hold to? You think it's okay for your pastor to go to a nightclub? Well, what are you doing there? You don't have any business in the same places that I don't have any business in. It's Christians, folks. It's God that we're trying to glorify, not a person or a particular standard. And see, Belshazzar's mistake is he says, well, my grandfather had a real problem with pride. But I can do the same thing. And see, it's not the same kind of an instance, but it's the same thing. What is pride by our definition in the book of Daniel? It's putting yourself in the place where God belongs and God in the place where you belong. And Daniel said, here's some vessels that can serve me. And those vessels were meant to serve God. And he said, I'll worship these things down here. And he was supposed to worship God. And he just thought he could take God's vessels and just put them down here and say, I conquered God. Boy, it's bad to forget the past. It's bad to forget history. So here's what God said. Thou his son, verse 22, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart. Talks about Nebuchadnezzar, his dwelling was with the wild asses, verse 21. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. Why was Nebuchadnezzar king? Because God made him. Why was Belshazzar king? Because God allowed him. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. See, Belshazzar couldn't plead ignorance. Could he? He pleaded irrelevance. So that's irrelevant. That was for my grandfather. It's not for me. God's not doing that anymore. Friend, God will judge. You'll stand in judgment if you're an unbeliever with people that have rebelled against God 1,000 years from now, with people that will have rebelled against God after you. They'll all stand in judgment. It'll be the same judgment. It won't be prorated. It won't be based on their personal warnings. You see, your warning is the history. Your warning is the past. And if God didn't tolerate sin in the past, it's a sure thing He won't tolerate sin in the present or in the future. We cannot ignore history. And if we want to know what God wants, let's stop looking sideways and start looking upwards. See, what we do is we look around for other Christians. We find the highest standard, and we say, well, that's a little high. And we find the lowest standard, and we say that's a little low. And we say, well, I'm going to put myself right here in between. And the high standard people, they're kind of nasty anyway. I don't want them to like me. Low standard people, we don't have anything in common. And I'll just try to come here in the middle where I don't disrupt anything. Most Christians make their standards based on what other Christians do. Most believers, and I'm telling you in fundamentalism, most believers figure out what their standards are based upon what others do. You find out, what do they do in this church? What do they say in that church? Well, if they think that's all right there, they're good people. And that's not how we as believers determine right and wrong. We determine right and wrong from going to the book of history, looking at what God did and what God said. And He hasn't changed. He hasn't changed. He says this, Thou hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of His house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, stone, which see not, we saw that in Psalm 115, didn't we? Nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is. Who is it that's responsible for our ability to breathe? God is. And whose are all thy ways hast thou not glorified? What was Belshazzar's sin? What?